Forgot to hang up the phone. I wasn't supposed to hear her. But I did. Is greater than he has to go to a nursing home, she whispered, laughing. I said nothing. I let them believe their plan was perfect. They sold the house for $890,000, returned from their business trip, smug smiles on their faces, thinking they'd won. But when the key fit in the door, they saw a note lying on the step. As they read it, their smiles vanished, their laughter died, and their screams filled the empty house. Because some mistakes, you only realize when it's too late. Before we continue, please comment where you are watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travels, and don't forget to subscribe for more interesting stories. I was sitting in my living room, the quiet hum of the evening wrapping around me, when I heard it. My daughter, careless as ever, had forgotten to hang up the phone. At first, I thought it was just ordinary chatter, but then her voice sliced through the calm like a knife. He has to go to a nursing home. I froze. My hands gripped the armrests of my chair tighter than I realized. My heart pounded, not just from shock, but from the mix of betrayal and disbelief that washed over me. She was talking about me, her own parent, like I was a burden to be discarded. I said nothing. I didn't want her to know I had heard. Instead, I sat there quietly, watching the soft flicker of the lamp, pretending to read an old newspaper. But inside, a storm was raging. Questions, anger, and hurt swirled through my mind. How could she think that, after everything I'd done for her? I remembered the day she was born, how I held her tiny hand and promised I'd always protect her. I remembered sleepless nights, scraped knees, birthday cakes baked with my own hands, and dreams I set aside just to make sure she could chase hers. And now, this. The house was silent after her voice faded. I could hear the faint click of the phone finally being hung up. My daughter was gone for now, off somewhere, unaware of the storm she had just ignited. I spent the next few hours moving through the house in a quiet daze. Every corner held a memory, her laughter echoing from the kitchen, the way she used to scribble drawings across the walls, the late-night talks in the living room where she poured out her fears and dreams. The walls seemed to whisper back at me, "You built this life with your hands, don't let it be dismissed." And that's when I realized something. This wasn't just about me. It was about respect, about justice, and about showing her and her husband that the life I built, the sacrifices I made, were not something to be tossed aside like trash. The next morning, I watched them leave for their business trip. They were smiling, confident, and unsuspecting. I couldn't help but notice how easily they carried themselves, convinced that everything was under their control. But control is an illusion, I thought. And sometimes, the quietest people, those who seem small, patient, or harmless, are the ones who notice everything, remember everything, and wait for the perfect moment to act. As the door clicked shut behind them, I sat down at my desk and picked up a pen. I began to write not a note, not a letter, but a plan. A way to make sure that when they returned, they would understand that nothing they did could erase the life I had lived, the sacrifices I had made, or the respect I deserved. The storm inside me had shifted. It was no longer just anger or hurt. It was quiet determination, and it was going to change everything. The house had been sold for $890,000. To anyone else, it was just a transaction, a number on a contract, a handshake, and a transfer of keys. But to me, it was so much more. Every corner, every wall, every floorboard held memories of decades of life, love, and struggle. This house was not just wood and brick, it was the foundation of my family. I watched from a distance as my daughter and her husband returned from their business trip, their smiles wide and confident, carrying suitcases and the invisible weight of their self-assuredness. They were already imagining the new life they would build with the money from the sale, as if all that history didn't exist. Inside, they laughed and chatted, speaking in tones of accomplishment and excitement. "We did it," her husband said, his voice crisp, proud. "Everything went perfectly," my daughter nodded, her eyes sparkling with satisfaction. completely unaware that the storm of their own making was quietly gathering just behind them. I moved quietly through the house, observing, remembering. The old clock in the hallway ticked steadily, marking each second with cold precision, as if reminding me that time waits for no one, not even for those who think they are untouchable. I remembered the mornings we spent cooking together, the evenings filled with music and stories, the countless nights where I had stayed up worrying about them while they slept peacefully. And yet, here they were, completely oblivious to the betrayal in their own hearts, the plan they had begun without even considering the person who had given them everything. I felt no anger outwardly, only a cold, measured calm. Rage was wasted energy. What mattered now was patience and the quiet execution of what was necessary. I began preparing the next steps carefully. Nothing flashy, nothing obvious. They should not know until the moment it became impossible to ignore. Every detail had to be precise, every reaction considered. The note, the message, the small seeds of disruption they had to arrive at the exact moment when the full weight of their actions would hit them. For now, though, I let them enjoy their triumph. Let them laugh, let them feel safe. That safety was fragile, and I intended to shatter it. In the kitchen, I quietly poured myself a cup of tea and thought about the exact moment when the ordinary click of a key turning in a lock would become the start of a nightmare they never saw coming. The chapter ends with them walking through the familiar door of the house, smiles still plastered on their faces, completely unaware that the memories, the sacrifices, and the love they had ignored were about to remind them just how powerful the quiet presence of a patient observer could be. The day they returned, the air seemed lighter, almost festive. My daughter and her husband moved with a sense of victory, carrying suitcases and a couple of shopping bags filled with new plans for their future. They laughed together, voices echoing through the driveway, unaware that every step they took brought them closer to a moment they would never forget. I watched from a shadowed corner of the living room, my eyes tracking their movements. Their confidence was palpable. My daughter swung the keys in her hand like a trophy, her husband by her side, giving the occasional self-satisfied nod. They were convinced the house, and by extension I, were under their control. "Ready?" her husband said, offering the door a confident push. My daughter grinned, inserting the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, the familiar click echoing like a harbinger. To them, it was normal. To me, it was the precise moment where anticipation and patience collided. They stepped inside, the creak of the floor beneath their feet mixing with the faint sound of birds outside. The house smelled faintly of polished wood, and memories the lingering scent of the meals we had cooked, the traces of celebrations long past. My daughter laughed, glancing around. "Feels smaller than I remember," she said casually. I remained invisible, quietly observing as they wandered from room to room, checking the walls, the furniture, the corners. They ran their fingers over surfaces that had once felt alive with shared moments. They were blind to the quiet presence of the past, blind to the reality that every memory in this house had been built by someone who still remembered and someone who had not forgotten. And then they saw it, a folded piece of paper lying on the doorstep. At first, they assumed it was a delivery note or a leftover advertisement, something ordinary, meaningless. My daughter bent down and picked it up. Her husband leaned over her shoulder, curiosity replacing the earlier confidence. The laughter faded from their voices, replaced by an uneasy tension that seemed to pulse through the room. I stayed silent. Every second stretched, charged with anticipation. The note was small, almost innocent-looking, yet the weight of what it contained was about to shatter the comfortable bubble they had carried with them. Their smiles wavered, their eyes narrowed, and in that brief pause, I felt the satisfaction of control, not cruelty, but the quiet balance of justice settling into place. The first words from the note were enough to make their confident facade crack. My daughter's hand trembled as she read, her husband's face pale. A shadow of disbelief replacing the arrogance they had worn so easily before. They didn't understand yet. They couldn't see the full scope of what was happening. All they knew was that something they had ignored, something they had dismissed, was staring them in the face. I watched as panic flickered in their eyes, barely contained. This house, once a backdrop to their childhood games and laughter, was now a stage for reckoning. And I, the quiet observer, had become the architect of their moment of truth. For the first time, they felt truly exposed, vulnerable, and uncertain. And I knew it was only the beginning. The folded paper in my daughter's hand felt heavier than it looked. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, almost unnervingly calm, and yet every word was charged with meaning. My daughter and her husband stood frozen, the air around them thick with unease. Their confidence, so carefully carried into the house, was beginning to crumble. What is this?" my daughter whispered, her voice shaking slightly. She glanced at her husband, whose usual composure was gone, replaced by a pale confusion that made him seem smaller than he had ever looked. He reached over to take the note, but I saw the hesitation in his hands. Even he felt the weight of what he was about to read. I stayed back, silent and still, letting them unravel at their own pace. There is power in observation, in patience, in watching those who think they are untouchable confront the reality they ignored for so long. The note didn't scream accusations. It didn't threaten. It simply reminded them of truths they had tried to overlook. Years of sacrifice, nights spent worrying, the countless small gestures that had built the foundation of our family, they were all laid bare in a few sentences. Each line was a quiet statement of fact, precise and unyielding. As they read, their faces changed. My daughter's eyes widened. Her lips pressed together so hard I thought she might bite her tongue. Her husband's shoulders slumped slightly, and a flicker of guilt passed across his usually confident face. The room, once filled with light laughter and casual conversation, became heavy with tension, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. "This, I don't understand," my daughter finally said, her voice barely audible. Why didn't you tell us before?" I stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. My presence was calm, almost invisible, but every word I spoke carried the weight of years. "I did tell you," I said quietly. "Every day, through actions, through patience, through the life I built, you just didn't listen." The note had already done its work. They were shaken not just by the words, but by the realization that they had underestimated me. They had assumed that age, quietness, or patience meant weakness. They were learning, perhaps too late, that it did not. The chapter explored their emotional highs and lows, panic, disbelief, a creeping sense of guilt, and the first sparks of fear. My daughter's hand trembled as she lowered the note to the floor. Her husband's eyes darted around the room, as if looking for answers outside themselves. They had walked into a trap they didn't know existed, an invisible web spun patiently, silently, by someone they thought powerless. And yet, there was more to come. The note had revealed the first layer of truth, but the full impact, the consequences of their words, their decisions, their dismissive behavior had not yet arrived. The air remained heavy, charged with tension, as they stood in the house that had once been their domain, now feeling foreign and threatening. I remained composed, almost serene. The storm was not over. It was only beginning, and by the time it reached its peak, they would understand the cost of forgetting the person who had given them everything. The silence in the house was suffocating. My daughter and her husband stood frozen, the note still on the floor between them like a silent judge. The weight of its words had settled, but it was only the beginning. They were beginning to see the consequences of their actions, the truth they had ignored for so long. I stepped closer, my voice calm but firm. "You thought this house, this life, was yours to control," I said. "That I was just a shadow in the background. But shadows have memory, and memory carries power. My daughter's lips quivered. Her husband clenched his fists, struggling to maintain the composure they had worn so easily just hours ago. But composure was gone. Panic and disbelief replaced it, leaving only raw vulnerability. They finally understood that the person they had dismissed, the parent they had spoken about as if disposable, was in control in ways they had never imagined. I walked slowly through the rooms, pointing to small reminders of the life we had shared. The faded photographs on the walls, the tiny marks where her children had learned to walk, the worn spots on the stairs where countless nights had been spent comforting a crying child. This, I said, is not just wood and brick. It's history, it's sacrifice, and it is mine just as much as it was yours. The daughter's voice cracked. We didn't mean... You did, I interrupted gently but firmly. Every word, every plan, every careless moment where you forgot what truly mattered you did. And now you feel the weight of it. Her husband sank onto the couch, his face pale. We thought... His voice trailed off, unable to complete the thought. The arrogance that had carried them through life was gone, replaced by fear, regret, and a desperate desire to undo the damage. But some things cannot be undone. I handed them the note back. Read it again, I said. Read it carefully. Every line, every word, is a mirror of your choices. This is the moment you realize what it means to underestimate someone who has nothing to lose but everything to protect. They read in silence, the room heavy with realization. I watched as the daughter's shoulders slumped, her eyes glistening with tears. For the first time, she saw me not as just a parent, but as a person who had fought, who had sacrificed, who had remembered every slight and every betrayal. And then, the weight of the house, of the memories, of the life they had almost erased, hit them fully. They understood that the world they had thought they controlled was not theirs to command. Respect, love, and family were not things to take lightly. They were earned, preserved, and, when ignored, reclaimed. I stepped back and watched as they slowly absorbed the lesson. There was no anger in me now, only a quiet, unshakable calm. The reckoning had come not with shouting, not with threats, but with truth, patience, and the power of someone who refused to be forgotten. The house was silent again, but it no longer belonged only to them. It belonged to the memories, the sacrifices, and the wisdom that had endured far longer than their arrogance. And I knew, as I watched them finally understand, that sometimes patience is stronger than rage, and silence is louder than any scream.